Barry Stevens here for theAnalysis-news, and I'm back here with for a second part of a conversation with Volodymyr Ishchenko and Richard Sakwa. Volodymyr Ishchenko is a Ukrainian who researches at the Institute for East European Studies at the Free University of Berlin and is a research affiliate at the Alameda Institute and author of a very good book, Towards the Abyss, Ukraine from Maidan to War. Richard Sakwa is a political scientist at the University of Kent in Canterbury, UK, and honorary prof at the Moscow State University. Richard's British, but also has family roots in the region. His books, Frontline Ukraine and the upcoming Russia-Ukrainian War, Follies of Empire, which is due out in March. So welcome back. And I want to talk a little bit about we started out by talking about this being an internationalized national conflict. And I want to talk a little bit about that international aspect of it. Back in 1991, just before the USSR collapsed as a state, President Gorbachev agreed to the unification of Germany on the promise that NATO would not expand. I think the phrase was 1 inch to the east. Whether this was a promise has been challenged by Western analysts. NATO did expand all the way to Russia's borders in the 90s and the 2000s. Now, it's argued that countries have the right to join any club they want. Russia's complaint that NATO presents a threat has been called ridiculous because NATO is a defensive alliance. And also, for another, there was no way that Ukraine was going to join NATO. So this was all excuses on the part of Western analysts. And Richard, perhaps you can start. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, well, it's a big issue. The analysts are right, of course, that there was no promise about no formal commitment on paper that NATO would not enlarge beyond the United Germany. The bigger issue goes back not just to 1989-91, when the Soviet Union basically gave up on the Cold War and hoped to move to a new phase of pan-continental unification and a new positive peace order. It goes back to 1945, when the debate in Potsdam, the effective idea was that Germany would be a neutral, non-militarized unity. And it was the West which reneged on the agreements in Potsdam, which has been forgotten, in first of all establishing Bizonia and then the Trizone, which then led by 1948-49 to the establishment of the Federal Republic, something which Moscow didn't want. And the fact that then it was effectively forced to establish what became the German Democratic Republic, East Germany. But that, if you like, bad faith, that betrayal of the promises made in Potsdam with Truman and Stalin and Churchill and an Attlee, was, in a sense, this poisoned element continued in 89-91. So that's a larger context, which we tend to forget. And of course, we can go back to the Stalin Note of 1952, which also then 1954, when the Soviet Union asked to join NATO, and then finally, when it was rebuffed violently, West Germany joined NATO in 1955. In other words, we're talking about the logs, the long-term fun, is this security dilemma. We have issues hanging back, continuing from 1945, that have still not been resolved. And they came to focus on Ukraine with such an intensity. You could argue that the accumulation of these security contradictions became so intense, and that is why this war in Ukraine is so intense, and compounded by the betrayal perceived over NATO enlargement, because there was a whole cascade of promises that NATO would not enlarge, but it was not put into the unification treaty in June 1990 for Germany, and that was Gorbachev's failure and a naive belief in the good faith of the West, which really was clearly misplaced. So we have this, as you say, this security dilemma, which then became worse and worse. And of course, you say this question about every country has the right to join an alliance of its own or to manage its own security conditions. Well, that is a bizarre statement in all sorts of ways. Not saying for you bizarre, but the idea is bizarre. It's bizarre because what was Cuba, the crisis of October 1962, all about? That when Cuba wanted to put nuclear weapons on its territory, that argument that any country can make its own decisions was very swiftly disabused. Today, Ireland is a neutral state. But if, for example, it decided we had a revolution in Ireland and it called on China to build a military base in Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, I think that London would pretty quickly intervene and stop that idea. So it's a nonsense that the whole founding principle of the post-Cold War security arrangements from the Charter of Paris of November 1990, all the way through to the Istanbul Declaration in 1999, Astana Declaration of 2010, all of them say that the security of one state cannot be at the expense of the security of the other. And by enlarging NATO, and those which argue it is a defensive body, after the interventions in the Balkans and the bombing of Yugoslavia for 78 days in 1999, the interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq, the destruction of the Libyan state in 2011, I think that the idea of it being a purely defensive body is simply meaningless. It is ultimately a framework to ensure the subordination of Europe to Washington. And now Washington doesn't need NATO to ensure its subordination, and therefore it is, NATO will almost certainly be discarded. So, as I've always said, it's not NATO per se. It's always the structures behind NATO and the thinking behind NATO, the enlargement of this political West. It doesn't matter, it could take any form, but it's ideology that there is a universalism in which you cannot have a Russian or even a Ukrainian particularism. And of course, Ukrainian elites have obviously got material aspects to it, but have exploited this condition, and hence they thought they could play this tiger. And of course, this tiger has come back to bite them very severely.
That's very interesting. So, Volodymyr, the security of one state cannot be at the expense of another. And can you comment on all that?
Yeah, I think that the NATO issue is obviously very important to understand the context of the war. I think also it's important to have a more precise understanding what was the issue with NATO. So I'm going back to my earlier comments, whether the Putin would really was really afraid of a possibility of a nuclear war with NATO, where Russia would be kind of like in a weaker position, and so that would get us to the security questions, right? But at the same time, I think there were other issues very much interconnected with NATO, where NATO was starting to be seen as as an instrument of democracy promotion in the post-Soviet space, in particular by George W. Bush. And that was part of at least of the legitimation for inviting Ukraine and Georgia into NATO in 2008, which was also seen as a step towards democracy promotion towards Russia. So I think the real threat from NATO was seen not just as a mighty military force that at some point may force Russia to do something by the threat of the overwhelming armies, but as something that might actually rather instigate an internal conflict in Russia, where part of the Russian society, part of the Russian opposition would try to repeat something that was repeated in Ukraine or in Georgia. So to destroy Russia, or at least destroy Putin's regime from inside. And NATO
a dangerous example. You're saying there would be.
Yeah, and NATO was playing this role, and also just I think a week ago, a very just a brilliant article was published in the Washington Quarterly by an American political scientist, Deborah Bukoyanis. She teaches at George Washington University. And she just brilliantly dismantled the major myths about the NATO expansion. For example, she showed that the initial reasons and justification for the expansion in the early 90s of NATO towards Eastern Europe, first Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, and so on, was not about Russian threat. It was not that the people in the West were saying that because of Russia presented such a big threat, we need to incorporate these countries into NATO. And it's not that the local Eastern European elites were saying that, yes, Russia presents for us as such a big threat, and that's why we need to join NATO. And it's not like the local population in Poland and Czech Republic were really afraid of Russia. In fact, more or less
that is exactly what I hear. I read.
Yeah, exactly. And this is kind of like a retrospective rewriting of history, contrary to the facts. The reality was that the biggest proponents of NATO expansion, including Brzezinski at that point, were actually saying Russia is not a threat. And that's why we can't expand NATO, because Russia is irrelevant. The Eastern European elites were saying that, yeah, it's not about Russian threat. It's a way to join the West, to join the civilization. The population in the early 90s in Poland and Czech Republic were actually not seeing Russia as the most prominent threat. They were more afraid of their historical conflicts. So, for example, the Poles were more afraid of Germans than Russians. The Poles were more afraid of Ukrainians, remembering the massacre that Ukrainian nationalists did during the Second World War in Volhynia, killing like thousands of Polish peasants in the ethnic cleansing. So the Poles were afraid more of Ukrainians than of Russia.
And I think they still have a dispute. Poland and Ukraine,
of course,
still does have a dispute.
Yeah, the Czechs were more afraid of Germans than of Russians. Hungarians were more afraid of Romanians than of Russians, and Romanians were more afraid of Hungarians than of Russians. So the NATO expansion was kind of like also solving the issue of preventing a repetition of the Yugoslav wars. Kind of like the security vacuum that appeared after the collapse of the Eastern Bloc in the Eastern Europe. So it was to prevent something that was happening in Yugoslavia at the same time, rather than to build a bloc against Russian aggression. And Russians as well didn't see that in those terms. What they were more afraid regarding Russia, at least in the early 90s, that a big part of their own population were under influence of Russia, more like something like remains of the, not exactly of the soft power, but again, that issue of the class antagonism towards the plebeian, towards poor, towards less educated, that they would not be as kind of like so enlightened and pro-Western. And so NATO is becoming a tool as the first step towards integration to the EU. And that allows to kind of like to incorporate their societies in a pro-Western bloc. And so Russia was not a threat in terms of the military power, which actually at that moment it was not, because it had like big issues to defeat Chechenian separatists at the same time, and they failed in the middle of the 90s. It was only with Putin that they were capable to defeat them. So at that moment, Russia was not actually seen so much as a real big military threat to them, but it was rather the way how to prevent coming backwards towards what is seen back to the communism, back to the Soviet Union, and towards the Europe, towards the West. That's how the NATO played out at that moment. And well, as a result, it actually created the issue of exclusion of Russia from expanding NATO. And again, the conversations between Putin and George W. Bush, which were published very recently as well and have been also discussed, in the media. The first conversation is actually about why Russia cannot join NATO. We would like to join NATO, and Putin says to George W., we suffered a lot. We abandoned our former territories, Ukraine, Central Asia, and so on and so forth. So Putin says we must be awarded. We must be awarded by joining to your club of civilization. And well, and then the real issue is about why exactly they were not, they did not allow Russia to join NATO in any capacity, and why they didn't proceed with considering these proposals. And we also, again, last year there have been publications in Der Spiegel based on the confidential documents how German elites were trying to prevent Clinton to start any serious proceeding about inviting Russia to NATO.
I would imagine
the problem was, of course, that if Russia would be invited to NATO, it would either change NATO fundamentally and make it, to say the least, more balanced with two powers with a huge nuclear arsenal. And we now see how actually unreliable United States can be in providing security, to say the least, or to change Russia profoundly. So Russia would be governed, and that huge nuclear arsenal, and probably also the Russian oil and gas, would be governed by the loyal comprador elites, which Putin did not belong to.
Okay, you said about this, there's a lot to unpack there, but you said about the negative example, or the unattractive example that possibly would be presented by the West. Now, does that suggest that Putin's motivation for the war was possibly partly internal politics?
I think that's, in my opinion, that is highly underestimated issues. The way how the war helped to consolidate the Russian elite, the Russian oligarchs, which were kind of like not really, it was kind of the marriage of convenience with Putin, rather than real loyalty. But they are now consolidated around him, also as an outcome of the war. The Russian society and the issue of succession, which is always a big issue for the regimes like Putin, personalistic regimes, and where the one person is decisive, and when this person becomes too old to be capable to rule the country, it's always the question who is going to be the next, and that successor is should be loyal enough not to put old Putin into prison, or to execute him, or to take everything that he and his family and his friends have acquired during the rule, and so on and so forth. So that's a big issue, and the war helps to solve the issue of succession. And so the consolidation and strengthening of the regime, and we now actually see it objectively, how Russia has been underestimated in terms of economy, in terms of the politics, in terms of the capacity to overcome the internal divisions, which played out in Russia, in fact, contra most of the expectations, at least in the West and in Ukraine. And in contrast to how Ukraine was perceived as a consolidated nation against the foreign aggressor, which overcome all of its internal divisions, and enthusiastic population volunteering for the front line and fighting for the country, or supporting the fight, and how it kind of like that spirit evaded quite quickly after the first major defeat of the Ukrainian counteroffensive in 2023. And in contrast to that, how Russia has been heavily underestimated in their capacity to proceed with the war, and there were real expectations in 2022 by many people that we need to just add sanctions, to send some more weapons to Ukraine, some more money, and Russian army will collapse, the Russian society will rebel against Putin. The Russian elite is going to abandon Putin, and it did not happen.
No.
And it just shows not just the wrong expectations, but also wrong understanding of the causes of the war, the misunderstanding of the material conflicts moving towards the war, the capacity of the war to build the state, to build elite, to build the society.
Yeah, war is often can consolidate power. I think of Thatcher in the Falklands War. She was, I think, about to lose the election. And maybe this assault on Venezuela will assist President Trump and his party. But Richard, I do think we should talk about the peace plan. But I just want to ask that just very briefly. There seems to be a general fear, and I think it's worth addressing in the West and in Europe especially, that Putin is going to, if we don't stand up to him, he's going to roll his tanks through the streets of Tallinn, Estonia, Riga, or Berlin. Is there any truth to this danger, or this assertion?
This is the domino theory, which, as you know, motivated Korean War first, but above all, the Vietnam War. That if we don't stop the communists in Vietnam,
we'll be fighting them in San Francisco Bay. Yeah,
that's right. Yes, and of course, this was all the way back to the Russiagate thing in 2016 that and also it was given this sort of apocalyptic inflection. No, I mean, Russia is finding it difficult to take over the last 10-15% of Donbass, of the Donetsk oblast, let alone rolling its tanks to Berlin or London. So it's war fever. There's a war fever in Europe, which is an interesting pathology, which I plan to study a bit more. And the sources of this pathology are multitudinous. It does go back to the 1990s, the way that that the moment of the failure of the end of the Cold War to establish a pan-European level. Can I go back to an earlier point, because this connects up, that the idea of NATO being the first stage towards EU membership. I remember the debates in the 1990s, and most of it was couched the other way around, of course, that there was a big question: does NATO go first, or the European Union enlargement go first? I mean, not enlargement as such membership, but the process of enlargement. So that's thing. And second, of course, the Partnership for Peace was very much touted as a way of filling the so-called security vacuum. But there was no security vacuum, and the imagination, or the imaginary at the time, of course, was very much the 1930s, that these small countries, Brent Scowcroft, George H.W. Bush, explicitly said it. We have to stay in Europe. If we leave, we're back to the 1930s. So the 1930s continued to haunt the debates of the 1990s and the 2000s in all sorts of ways. But the idea that this war in Ukraine is a war for civilization, is a war for, and also, of course, the other argument is that if the West relents in one way or another in Ukraine, then of course it will embolden all the other so-called autocracies, above all China, and will then attack Taiwan, and who knows what's going to happen. I think these are false arguments, false analogies. Of course, things are connected, and countries learn from experiences elsewhere. But no, this is a separate, and may I, and no disrespect and no diminution of the catastrophic nature of this war, but ultimately it is so far a regional war with European significance. Russia itself, well, for the United States, it's a sideshow. I mean, honestly, it's a sideshow. And, as far as they're concerned, 10,000, 100,000, a million Ukrainian dead, who cares? That's the cynicism in Washington. It's a small price to pay. And the Ukrainians are willing to die for weakening Russia. Well, let them get on with it. I'm sorry about the cynicism of it, and I don't for a second diminish the monstrous character of this war. In fact, it's because I can see the monstrous character of the war that I'm saying that. Meanwhile, Russia is also, this war is compartmentalized. It's fighting it. The hardliners in Russia keep saying, Karaganov and others, we should, send a nuclear missile sailing across the bows of these reckless Western leaders, and so on, to tell them. But Putin's got other things. As far as he's concerned, it's a terrible war, huge drain, but it has allowed Russia to do things that it would not be able to do in the so-called globalizing, the liberal globalist model, which has now been entirely repudiated. We have going back to old-fashioned autarkic developmental state. And Russia is developing astonishingly. It has opened up more metro stations in the last year than London has since the Second World War, and so on. And Shanghai, China is loving it. It's got cheap, the energy that used to power European industry, German pharmaceutical, cement making, metal making, and so on. All of that is gone, and at a discount to China. So they can actually now use the Russian gas. Even now, German companies are building factories in China with using Russian gas to do what they used to do on the Ruhr and so on. This is the suicide of Europe, in all sorts of ways. Russia's getting on quite well. I was traveling in the summer from Moscow to Pskov, and for 400 kilometers or 600 kilometers, for 300 of them, they were widening the motorway. There were thousands of bulldozers and diggers and so on. And yet in the West, they say there's a shortage of diggers and bulldozers and workers. There were thousands of workers who are doing this, and they're now building high-speed railway to Kazan and so on. So Russia's developing. United States is developing. China's developing. India's developing. We in Europe are bogged down in this catastrophic war, and there is no peace in prospect. The coalition of the willing is meeting on the 6th of January as we talk. And what is it? It's all about putting European boots on the ground in Ukraine for a peace that does not exist.
Okay, let's talk about the peace prospect or the peace proposal that the Trump regime has advanced, and yeah, just to note that the casualties have been immense in this war. It's ground on in with a new kind of warfare that seems to favor drones and but also trenches and foxholes, and I think hundreds of thousands of soldiers have died. One reads many different numbers, and also civilians. This is obviously, for so many reasons, needs to stop. And I think both of you, Volodymyr, I think you still have family in the region and friends, presumably, in Ukraine. You probably know people in the army. Yeah. So it's and Richard, I know you also have family history in the bloodlands, as they're sometimes called. So how do we get out of it? And let's talk about these 20-ish points of this peace plan. Involve Ukraine giving up territory that it actually still militarily more or less controls, having a limited army, not being in NATO, although there seems to be a talk about security guarantees, and European troops there, which seems extremely unlikely. But also, interestingly, extractive rights for the United States, administration by BlackRock, has been floated around. How do you see the situation now with these peace proposals and possibilities? Let's start with Volodymyr.
Well, I see these 28 points prepared by probably Dmitriev and Witkov. They, in my view, they fixate the defeat of Ukraine, but not capitulation. And what's amusing about them, at least in the context of the discussions about the origins of the war in particularly, and about so-called maximalist goals that Putin has, including destroying Ukrainian nation, conquering Ukraine, eliminating Ukrainian identity, how far those 28 points are from those perceived maximalist goals, which are like seriously discussed by a big section of the experts, academics, as the real ideological, irrational reasons of the war that Putin has just totally obsessed with, and that's why he's always talking about history and disregarding all the material, well, rational conflict issues that were driving to the war.
So he's going to reject it.
And so we see, so at the moment when Russia has objectively upper hand at the front line, where it's more consolidated economically, politically, even looks like more better in the international context, with EU losing more and more legitimacy, with the United States losing legitimacy, with more and more rifts among the Western elites with support of Ukraine, and with the escalating crisis within Ukraine itself, in terms of not just casualties, but also the number of deserters, the number of soldiers going AWOL at high record number levels,
and exposure of corruption.
The corruption scandals, the fragmentation of the political elite in Ukraine, the problems that Zelensky has with keeping control, and all the possible investigations coming closer and closer towards him. And at this moment, Putin might be seriously ready to discuss something based on the 28 points, and this is exactly what he said, that this can be the basis of the discussion. Right? Maybe not necessarily what they put at those points, and probably unlikely what the Ukraine and EU have been discussing afterwards with the military contingent from the EU on the Ukrainian territory, and so on and so forth. So it's probably unlikely to be accepted. And that's also the point, that unlike all those ideological identity history issues which are supposedly driving the war, and which I have never believed in as a serious explanation, the question of NATO is always present in what Putin demands. So he's pretty consistent that Ukraine must be neutral. He's been also consistent about so-called demilitarization. And then when we are speaking about limited army, the 600,000, which is a limit for the Ukrainian army, is something. It's in fact more than Ukraine might be capable economically to support in the peacetime, without very massive inflow of money from the European Union, because the United States seems like unlikely to support Ukraine financially anymore, at least under Trump administration or his successors. And the 600,000, it's more than twice bigger than the Ukrainian army before the start of the full-scale invasion, more than the army which was actually capable to defeat the Russians at the very early stage. And so the most important question is how even to keep Ukrainian males inside Ukraine after ending the war, and hopefully opening the borders for
250,000 prosecutions or charges of for desertion. Some incredible number.
Desertion, and evolved before they classified that information as a matter of national security. So even discussing this becomes kind of dangerous, understanding the level of, well, the lack of desire for so many of Ukrainians to continue to die in this war, to put it just simply. At this moment, we are discussing this peace plan, which in a certain way incorporates all practically everything that Putin demanded in some form: demilitarization, even some form of denazification, neutrality, control over the territories which they control now, and, well, the most difficult issue, abandoning the parts of Donbass which Russia does not control at this moment. But at the same time, pretty far of humiliating or well, making Ukraine a kind of like state without any sovereignty and without any capacity to defend itself. That's not what is on the table, at least by this moment.
And so it seems possibly a bit hopeful that this might actually come to something. Richard, do you think it will come to anything?
If we stick to the 28 points or some variant of them as the beginning of negotiations, which basically is going back to the agenda of the Istanbul talks just a couple of months after the beginning of the war, then there is a chance for peace. But as we know, the European powers are dead set against any discussion of the 28-point framework, the Istanbul framework, i.e. neutrality and all the things that Volodymyr has just mentioned, instead of which they are having endless meetings amongst themselves. And of course, they went off to Trump and are trying to convince Trump as well to renege on the 28 points, which of course builds on the Alaska meeting between Trump and Putin last August. So that channel, if you like, the 28-point channel, which is, let's call it the Alaska channel, is meeting the Brussels channel, which is resolutely, and the Brussels-London channel, which is resolutely opposed to any of this. And it is, as you saw, the endless debates at the end of 2025 about not just impounding, but sequestering the Russian finances, money held in Euroclear and in other accounts in the European Union, to use that to fund the continuation of the war for 2 more years. They failed, as you know. The Brussels Prime Minister, the Belgian Prime Minister, refused to allow this, and others, the Christine Lagarde, head of the European Central Bank and so on, opposed it. And so they've raised a 90
No, it's a dangerous precedent, I would imagine, for seizing people's money.
Well, indeed, it's not the first time they've seized Venezuelan assets before. They seized Afghans, one of the poorest countries in the world, and they effectively stole what they had, which of course probably the money mostly came from the United States in the first place. But that's another issue. Iranian money has been impounded for 50 years, so it's reserves.
Yeah.
So it's certainly not the first time. Absolutely, but this 90 billion euro loan, which they've got, is designed to keep Ukraine in the war for 2 more years. And the coalition of the willing is not about peace. It's about, it's basically living in fantasy land. I think, let me put it very well, that it recognizes effectively Ukraine's defeat, but not its capitulation, that Ukraine, if the 28 or the Alaska-Istanbul framework continued, it would remain a sovereign state able to sort out its own thing, with a status analogous to Finland after the war, Austria, Ireland, Cyprus, other neutral states. So there's nothing bad about that. It has allowed these countries to develop as thriving democracies, thriving societies in all sorts of ways. Instead of which, the coalition of the willing, led above all by London. I mean, Britain has only one foreign policy, and that is to keep the war going, to defeat Russia. Why European Union and Britain is so obsessed, almost to a point of pathology. Callas, for example, she goes to China and talks in a humiliating manner. China, stop buying Russian oil and so on, as if she was lecturing a small child.
But if I can just interject for a second, if they're so excited about defeating Russia, why aren't they mobilizing millions and millions of soldiers? Which would seem to be the logical thing to do if you're determined to defeat Russia.
Well, they don't want to. First of all, they've all got budgetary crises. Second, they're not going to take money away from welfare. As long as the Ukrainians are willing to die on the battlefield to weaken Russia, as I said, what's not to like about it? If only this is.
So it is logical. They just are weakening what they can perceive as their inevitable enemy.
But it shows, again, more profoundly, this extraordinary bankruptcy of thinking in London and the European Union, as opposed to the Trumpian escape from the impasse. You may not like where it has escaped to, but it has escaped. That logic of the political West, which became more and more intellectually bankrupt, more and more militaristic, more and more hermetic, more and more aggressive, less and less able to conduct normal diplomacy. There's a whole syndrome. which we can't go into now, which I'm trying to look at, this huge syndrome of how the Cold War liberalism then radicalized after the end of the Cold War. It then eroded the very bases of this Europeanism that Ukrainian liberals and others are so desperate to join. Understandably, because they have an abstract representation of what Europe pretends to be. But what it has now become is something in the failure of leadership in the Western European countries. So the coalition of the willing, even the use of this term, the coalition of the willing, is the term used for the illegal invasion of Iraq in 2003. But the mere fact that they're willing to use this term again for a disgraceful episode,
that's a good point.
Hundreds of thousands of deaths, if not millions, in Iraq, is used again in this case. It's a sort of an escape from reality.
One thing I wanted to ask, when you talk about the Alaska process and you talk about the Brussels process, I've wondered, why isn't there a United Nations process?
Yeah.
And it just seems entirely absent. In fact, when the talk is of putting troops in there, and I still don't understand why a security guarantee from the United States and having European troops in Ukraine is very substantially different from their belonging to NATO. But if you are going to have soldiers in there, why it does? I haven't heard it being discussed that they could be blue helmets.
It has been mentioned at various points earlier. It's not on the agenda at the moment. You're absolutely right that the whole framework of United Nations and more broadly the Charter International System and a body of international law built on its framework has been one of the major collateral damage elements of this Russo-Ukrainian war. And of course, it is no less damaged by the war in West Asia, in Gaza and the West Bank.
Frankly now by the
Venezuela.
attack on Venezuela, yes.
And of course, that could only be the beginning.
And then next
Cuba,
Greenland, who knows?
Well, Greenland's one thing, but Cuba is the other thing.
Yes.
Absolutely. So, in other words, we're today witnessing not just the breakdown of the post-Cold War so-called European security order, but it's a much larger breakdown, which is of the 1945 settlement and establishment of the UN-based Charter International System. And this is a far more, no less significant development of our times. And that's why we need to stand. But already, the political West undermined and eroded the very normative foundations on which the United Nations is supposed to have worked, and the irresponsible way in which the United States, the United Kingdom, and France have seized and dominated the Secretariat of the United Nations for the last few years. They've systematically blocked China and others playing the role that they deserve to play in it. That these countries have voted almost entirely as a bloc and have not been willing to engage in diplomacy with Russia and China well before this conflict now. And in other words, the political West substituted for the United Nations and for the Charter system. And now
I always think that the phrase that they love to use, at least in Canada, is the rules-based international order. And I always wonder, why don't you just talk about international law, which would seem to me to be the basis of the United Nations Charter. But no, I think we should wind up this discussion, which has been incredibly rich and interesting, and actually could easily go on, as far as I'm concerned, in the middle of the Canadian afternoon for another hour or two. But for you guys, of course, it's the evening. I think would like to. Well, there was one important question I do want to ask, and then to ask you whether you have hope and how progressive-minded people could support any hope that there is. But the first question I want to ask before I get to that is that, let's say we do get peace in the near term. Russia has really militarized its economy, mobilized poor boys from the regions. Sure, they're building superhighways, but there is a lot of militarization that's happened. How does it go back? Does it switch to an economy based on development or redistribution, the social wage? Or is it like the United States at the height of the Cold War? Does that machine need more enemies to slay? What happens if they do get peace in Russia? So I don't know who to ask that question to, so I'll throw it open to either of you.
Yeah, can I just say that I think that I disagree, question slightly the formulation. Russia certainly has achieved a degree of mobilization to fight this war, but and military Keynesianism, and it's done all sorts of things, and it has, going back to some of the earlier points, Russia has a, if you like, still a Sovietized economy, but in a sense, it's even deeper than that. Russia has a good old-fashioned industrial economy. It had huge mothballed plants, which are now working 24/7, churning out armored vehicles and 152 millimeter shells and so on and so forth. Yet, at the same time, this we're talking about 6% of the Russian GDP is devoted to military, which is remarkably low compared to the Soviet times when it was 15 to 20%. And there's an enormous amount of other things going on. You just need to go to Russia and you see that the war is, yes, you have posters everywhere, recruitment, and the posters extolling the heroism of Ivan Ivanovich and so on and so forth. Quite often, by the way, from Buryatia, Udmurtia, and other parts and elsewhere. In other words, specifically some of the ethnic minority regions, Bashkortostan, which has suffered suffered the single largest number of casualties have come from Bashkortostan. So rather opposed to Moscow, St. Petersburg. And there's all sorts of issues. But the demobilization would be, of course, at the end of a war, difficult. Yet it is still this huge civilian economy is powering ahead in partnership with China. China, for example, has taken over the old plants, the Ford and all the other Toyotas who left Russia in 2022. They've now, the Cherries, and they're not called that, this Build Your Dreams, the owner company behind it, I just saw the figures today, have now taken over 50% of the Russian car market, and it's booming. The Russian economy is going to be down to growth of about 1% in 2025, down from about 4% the previous year. But the inflation is falling, and it's now about 6%. Interest rates down to 16%, which are extraordinarily high. VAT going up to 22%. Went up on the 1st of January to pay the budget, which is under pressure because oil price is low. There's a glut of oil, which makes the Venezuela business, by the way, the arguments about oil is difficult. So, in other words, the resilience of the Russian economy, as we mentioned earlier, is far stronger. And also about this question about elite consolidation. Russia did not need this war to consolidate the elite. It's an extraordinarily complex system. I've looked at it in terms of, around the Kremlin and the management. There's all sorts of, there's hierarchy there, but there's always been a very powerful heterarchy, this sort of horizontalism, which is why you actually have this strong power elite in the center to stop this centrifugal element, which at a weakening of central power, repeatedly in Russian history, you have this centrifugal elements. But there's some system now established, which even after Putin, they're easy enough to find somebody who is loyal, who committed to the same ideology and so on. Dumin and a whole stack of names you could list now. So the succession is always important, but there's mechanisms in place which will manage that. In other words, Russia will, whatever happens in this war, could go on for another year, 2 years, 5 years. Yeah, it's difficult, but it can keep it up. Whether Ukraine can, that's another question. Whether the European Union and NATO can is another question.
Well, let's, Volodymyr, let me ask you just briefly comment on the prospects for Ukraine post-war. Do you think your country will, in fact, what Richard was saying, as I understand it, is that if you did have a kind of Finlandization or a neutrality for Ukraine, for the parts of Ukraine that are not occupied or gone to Russia, that Ukraine could thrive, and yet you've got a country surviving on foreign credits, corrupt, divided, wounded, desperately, badly. How do you see it, assuming we have peace?
Well, honestly, at this moment, the most important question is how to save as many people as possible and as much of remaining Ukrainian infrastructure as possible. That's the first thing on the agenda, and I've been always a bit kind of like skeptical about this very early discussion about Ukraine's reconstruction, because it was not even clear how much we'll be able to save to reconstruct. So I mean, it's not even necessarily Finland, but even at this moment, even something like Georgia would look better than what we have right now. So the Ukrainian local elite is taking its sovereign decision to attempt to find a balance between EU, United States, Russia. And in this balance, to try to proceed with more or less pragmatic line, as the Georgian, a small country, which did find, or at least tries to find its place also at the intersection of different great powers. And whether the Ukrainian elite would be capable to do this, there's obviously a lot of factors that would work against it, and nationalism and the number of well, growing far right that became only stronger in the army, the veterans, the destroyed economy, the economy that would require more financial aid to even sustain the people within Ukraine, to provide them jobs, to provide them any prospect to live there. That would require still enormous financial mobilization, which at this moment cannot be taken for granted, considering the interests of the United States, well, probably taken away from this region and only trying to profit. You mentioned this extractivist paragraphs in the peace deal, which, well, remind old colonial arrangements, but also the crisis in the European Union, the crisis of European economies, and the more and more indebtedness of the biggest European economies, the financial crisis which is looming in France, and that's all is accumulating, which makes the prospects of supporting Ukraine very difficult. And obviously, at this point, I think that the most important thing is to think how to say what we have, and because we also understand that no regime in Russia is forever. We also understand that no American president is forever. We even understand now that the European Union is probably also not forever. But at certain point, Ukraine might find better opportunities to thrive, to get back to the development procedure. But to get there, we at least need to save what we have, and to preserve the remaining conditions to get revived as a nation. And that's, I think, that's the most important thing to think about at this moment.
Here. Yeah, to save what we have, and to just stop the killing, stop the violence, perhaps, in more than anything. And I wonder, just the last question, how might progressive-minded people who've listened to these couple of hours of you guys talking, how might we, what could we do to support an end to violence and the prospects for a more rational and decent world in Eastern Europe? Anything or nothing? Is there no hope for it?
I think have more conversations like this, basically rational, normal conversations, which, seeking after truth. The public sphere in Western Europe and the United Kingdom is so heavily distorted and so ideologized that and simple reductionist, autocracy versus democracy, pro-Moscow, pro whatever this and anti that. It's time to move beyond that sort of Cold War language and genuinely rebuild our own societies based on the normative values which we profess and which I certainly still cling to. I used to say support, and I do support the United Nations and the body of international law, but unfortunately, even that now is weakened. We did have a moment when we were thinking of a new political party in Britain, as you know, your party, but that doesn't seem to be really developing effectively. Maybe it will. I hope it does. But and the Labour Party itself, of course, in our country. So our political elites are exhausted. Our political systems are exhausted. It's all.
But we can hold to the values and express them.
Yes.
Yeah, and it's not just about values, and of course the rational discussion is also very important. We also understood it, how the debates went completely rational with the start of the war in Ukraine, and at this moment with what's happened in Gaza, with what happened in Venezuela now, we are now reconsidering how badly there was the reaction of the liberal and progressive public was to the start of the war in Ukraine, and how really like obscurantist arguments became dominant at that moment. And at this moment of the rising American imperialism, the ethnic cleansings which are happening in many parts of the world, the economic crisis, we can put Ukraine in this much bigger context. And we also understand that the war in Ukraine has been a part of the developing global crisis. And well, the most abstract response, of course, would be to build our own alternatives, to find a way to offer a better social, political, economic systems, which would remove the material
contradiction
reality behind the escalating wars. A more immediate issue is, of course, the peace movement, because we now understand that the wars of aggressions are going to happen in many parts of the world. The biggest military power in the world is the biggest driver of these wars. And there must be mobilization of people in many parts of the country. In Canada, specifically, well, Canada is explicitly under threat, I think, by Trump now. And we also see that Trump is pretty serious when he says about Panama Channel, about Venezuela, Colombia, Mexico, Greenland, probably Canada as well. And so that requires a global peace movement that would be working towards preventing their own governments to be involved into the new wars that are quite possible in the nearest future. But at the same time, it's not just the reactive agenda against what the governments are doing, but it's all of course, there should be also the forward-looking agenda, which the left has been talking about for quite a long time, not very successfully, but at this moment it becomes pretty clear how acute, how important this is, how to build a better society that would remove the material conditions behind the escalating war, which at this moment could mean the end of the humanity itself.
Thank you both, Volodymyr Ishchenko and Richard Sakwa in Germany and in Britain. And thank you from here in Toronto. And well, I look forward to speaking to you both again in a time of peace, perhaps months from now, perhaps years from now, but as soon as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you.